Welcome to VBA from Excel Macro to Code. I'm TrainerLori. What is VBA from Macro? Well, macros is a way of recording steps to automate your worksheet reformatting, and I encourage you to learn how to do that before you watch this class. But VBA code allows you to enable to see the recorded steps as words so you can change and manage them without having to re-record the macros. First, I would recommend that you add your developer ribbon. You can go to File Options and add the developer ribbon simply by clicking it and then click OK. Now that you have the developer ribbon, you'll want to record your macro. You can either find it right there up on the ribbon, or if you've added it to your status bar by right-clicking on the status bar, you'll be able to record down here at the next to Ready. When you click the record button, it says what do you want to name your macro, what shortcut key do you want to give, where do you want to store it, and a brief description. Please note this description. It says this is a test macro to see what happens in VBA. We're going to see that later in VBA. I want to point it out to you now. Then when you click OK, you can start recording. And as you record all the steps, down here this changes to a stop recording option. So you'll do your steps and then you'll hit stop recording. Now that we've recorded our macro, we'll go back into our Developer tab and click on Macros, and then you'll see a list of all the macros. There's the one that we just recorded, no spaces allowed. And we'll click the Edit button to open it in Visual Basic. When we open the Visual Basic module, you can see that there is the name of it, no spaces allowed, and this is the test macro to see what happens. Remember our description that comes up there, and also the keyboard shortcut, as well as the code of the steps that we recorded. A module is a sheet to write or store code, and you'll see on the left are all the modules. And a sub, or a sub-procedure, is a macro that's written instead of recorded. So once you've recorded your macro, you will always be able to see it in this view. This is what VBA would look like without a macro. Pretty blank. See, there's no modules, there's no procedures. But if we have the modules, make sure that you scroll down so that you can see them. This is called Project Explore, and this is where you can see all the things that are going on in that workbook. And then, of course, on the right is the code. You'll notice that there is an Excel button here that'll take you back to Excel again. Although sometimes we don't want to stay in Visual Basic, so if you want to completely close it, you just hit the X button, and there's no need to save because once you make a change in here, it is saved. Period. You're done. And then you can simply close Visual Basic and get right back into Excel again. Let's look at this in a little more detail. We saw the modules over here, and now we can see that the module name is listed up here as well. And then this is the procedure. In fact, there are two procedures, and I can tell because there's a line in between them. And there's two names. There's one name up here and one name down here. So let's look at it in a little more detail. So I said the name is at the beginning. Right after the word sub is the name of the macro. And when we save our macros, we can't put spaces in them because it's in code, and code doesn't like spaces. So that's why we would have to use an underscore or a camel case. And by default, it will always put in two parentheses after this. Now you probably know this from functions in Excel, like equals sum. It also has two parentheses after it. And what goes inside those parentheses, if anything, are called arguments. This is the end of the macro. Notice that it starts with sub, the sub procedure, and it ends with sub. So this is the beginning, this is the end. Then you can see the descriptions in green, and then all the actions that were recorded in this macro are in between. Notice the color coding. Black is normal text and a typical procedure. So you can see that the name of the macro was black and the actions that it does is in black. Green is what we saw as description. It's a comments line. And I put a single quote here to remind you that if you wanted to add more, if you didn't put one in, you can simply put in a single quote and it will turn green and it will be a description or comments. It will not affect the macro unless you wanted to change the keyboard shortcut, which you could certainly do there. Blue are words that are recognized as VBA. These are our keywords. And then if you had red, that means that you had an error. Those are offending lines. Remember, in our macro, our option for description and keyboard shortcut were here, and you can't get that back again once you've recorded your macro unless you come into Visual Basic. These are 3 macros that I have, and this is what it looks like if we're just looking at a list of macros, but we want to look at those in code. So now there's our 3 macros in code, and notice that there's a line in between, and that's put in by default. Every time you create a new one, it just puts in that line to show this is the end of one and the beginning of the next one. If you wanted to, at this point, you know enough that you could come here and change the name of the macro, because it's very difficult to change the name of a macro except rewriting it and saving it with the same name. Well, in the recording method, but by coming into code, you can come in and just type in a new name for your macro. Another thing we can do is change the description in here, and you can do this on any of these macros. I'm just spreading it out so you can see. So you can change the description, and of course you can change the keyboard shortcut. So those are things that we all know now that you can do to change your macro in Visual Basic. Now that we've looked at the structure of the macro, we want to look at now the actions. And I like to divide that into 2 parts, the where and the what. And you can see that the where is on the left side of the dot, and the what is on the right side. Now occasionally there may be a few more dots in between, and we'll look at those in detail, but right now we want to look at the where. These are some where options. The first one you see here is cells. It says cells 1, 6, and those are in parentheses. What is 1? That's the row. The first one is always the row, the second one is always the column. And if you're writing code, you might get used to this. This would be F1. If we were looking at an Excel spreadsheet, it would be F1. Therefore, if cells 1, 6 is kind of awkward for you, you might want to use range instead. Now, if you use range to write your where, notice you have to put in the double quotation marks, and so it's hard to remember. So either way, it's not super easy, but it is fairly easy this way because you can see A1 through G9. Notice the colon, that means through, just as if you were using a function like sum in Excel. And this one has a comma, and just like in Excel functions, that would be and. So this would be 2 cells and only 2 cells, and this is a whole range of A1 through G9. Now these, again, is a range, but now you can see we're using the cell option and the range option. And then finally we have object.currentRegin. So now it's wherever is surrounding my cursor, wherever my cursor happens to be, it's the current region. And where does it stop? At a blank row or column. So the current region would be anything surrounding my cell, my cursor, that is not a blank row or column. And then the last one here is worksheets. In this case, in the worksheet named budget, in the range A1 through B5. And so we have 2 things. There's a dot connecting the 2 wheres before we get to what. Alright, let's go back to our 3 macros and look at some of the wheres. So you can see rows 1 through 1. We can see range C1. We see selection. Come down here, there's selection again. That means whatever I have already selected. It could be a cell, it could be a range. There's columns. In fact, it's columns dot entire column. And then down here is active cell. An active cell is very common. It's wherever your cursor happens to be, whether it's actually selected, clicked and dragged over, or just clicked in. Now the last one is ActiveCell.offset.range.select. So what does that offset mean? Well, let's look at that in more detail. When you're recording your macros, you do have an option for relative references. And again, if you don't understand this in full detail, you might want to watch a previous class I created on recording macros. That relative references means that it has offset in it. Offset means relative. And essentially, let me explain that. If I were to have it off, and this is what it looks like if it's off, it doesn't have a gold bar around it, then that means the macro is going to move the cursor to a specific location. So I'm going to tell the macro to go somewhere. However, if it's gold around it, then it's kind of like bold. That means do it here. So wherever my cursor happens to be, like when I use bold, that becomes that's the one that gets changed. So here's a way to remember this, because it is difficult to remember which is which. The gold one is bold. The gold one is bold. Just like the bold, does it wherever you happen to be, that's the one that's gold, and that is the one that is offset. So what does that mean? Well, in this case, if I say active cell dot offset 1, 0, 1 means row, and it's going to go down 1 row and over 0 columns. So that, in other words, it's going to move my cursor just below wherever my active cell is. In this case, offset means it has a minus, so that means it's moving to the left. If it doesn't have a minus, it moves to the right. If it has a minus, it moves to the left. So in this case, it moves no rows and over 3 columns. Now that we have looked at the wheres, we want to decide our whats, our what options. And the nice thing is if you're writing code, and that we'll cover in another class, but if you're writing code, you can just start writing it after you've put in the where dot, then this helper pops up to show you the different objects that are available to you. But in this case, we'll look at select. We've already saw that one. And when you select it, you've clicked on it essentially. In this case, value equals 10, so it's going to change that range and fill it with the number 10. In this case, it's going to copy that range. In this case, it's going to take only the first cell out of this whole range and make it yellow. And then finally, the last one, we saw that before, is the where. And now what we're going to do with that range is to fill it with the letters NA. Notice NA is in quotes. That means just the NA will appear. It is text, and that's why it's in quotes. Let's look at our 3 macros now for the what side. So we saw some of the where side, but now the what is select, activate to make happen. To make the font, notice this is selection dot font, so that means that it's 2-part aware, and now it's bold, and then the bold is true. So if I wanted to make that the opposite, you can see the opposite of true would be false. So if I decide I don't want it bold, I could come in here and make that false. Down here, it's going to take the selection and turn it into a number format. In fact, this is long date number format. And this one is going to put in a formula, and this one is simply going to select. Now, the last thing that you'd want to do with your macro after you've created it is maybe send it to somebody. You've made this wonderful macro and you want to share it with other people, then you can simply export it. And in Visual Basic, you right-click on the module and choose Export File. And when you do that, you can save it as a BAS file. That's all. See you next time.